Hey there, I'm SuperDerek and I make thoughtful and thought-provoking videos for gamers who love role-playing games, so if you're new here, get subscribed because this video is about to be a doozy. The story of the Mother series is one full of near misses, long shots, and scrappy and determined fandoms who refuse to let the series fall through the cracks. Mother 1 on the NES didn't face too much trouble during production, and in fact did quite well in Japan, but when the game was about to release in the West, Nintendo of America pulled the plug. Only through pure chance was that complete English localization discovered on a beta cartridge and leaked onto the internet. The sequel, EarthBound, suffered several production difficulties, and it would have been cancelled if not for the direct intervention of Satoru Iwata. The localization process was also handled mostly by one guy who had only localized a single puzzle game prior, yet somehow the game came out nearly flawlessly, only to then experience poor sales, leaving the future of the series in the West in jeopardy. We talked about those stories more in depth in my Mother 1 and EarthBound videos respectively, but this is the story of how we finally got Mother 3. I was in my early teens, or maybe even younger, when I got a used copy of EarthBound and eventually fell in love with it. But EarthBound didn't sell well, not at all in the West for the most part, only selling about 140,000 copies. Despite giant boxes of EarthBound ending up in bargain bins at big toy stores, Mother 2's sales in Japan were at least strong enough to justify a third entry in the series. Shigesato Itoi would continue working with his team from EarthBound. Initial planning for the follow-up targeted a release for the Super Nintendo, but with only a couple years left remaining in the console's lifespan, the team eventually pivoted to the Nintendo's upcoming console, the Nintendo Ultra 64, which would eventually bring polygonal titles into the mainstream. Shigesato Itoi wanted to do something truly special with this release. He wanted to make a game that felt like a Hollywood production. Partway through development though, the team suffered their first setback. They had been planning for EarthBound 64 with the specs and memory targets provided by Nintendo for the upcoming console. However, the finalized specs for the Nintendo 64 were weaker than anticipated, requiring the development team to rework assets to scale the game back to fit onto the weaker hardware. But there was also another problem. The Nintendo 64 would continue using cartridge-based games to minimize load times. These ROM chips were fast, but they weren't cheap. An optical disc as used by Sony's PlayStation or Sega's Saturn consoles would hold games over 700 megabytes in size, but the standard Nintendo 64 cartridge could only hold up to 4 megabytes by comparison. Extra storage in the cartridge was possible, but it would also increase the manufacture costs substantially, eating into any profitability that EarthBound 64 might have managed. This would later prove to be too cost-prohibitive for most RPG developers of the era, like Squaresoft or Enix, and eventually left the Nintendo 64 a veritable desert for RPG fans. I remember playing a copy of Quest 64 back in the day just to hold me over since I didn't own a PlayStation back in the day. These felt like the dark ages for me. However, in development at the time was a new add-on accessory for the Nintendo 64, what they called the 64DD. This disc-based expansion did not use the off-the-shelf lasers and optical sensors that were used by the TurboGrafx CD or Sega CD of the previous generations, but instead would be using a proprietary magnetic storage technology similar to zip disk or floppy disk drive. Thus the title 64DD. Disk drive. This new expansion would increase the available storage for games from 4 megabytes to 64 megabytes, a 16 times increase in capacity without any additional cost. In order to help cope with the change of the specifications of the Nintendo 64, Shigesato Itoi and his team would leverage the expanded capabilities of the 64DD and release EarthBound 64 as a launch title for that system. I vaguely remember hearing back in middle school from a friend who was subscribed to EGM, Electronic Gaming Monthly, talking about how he had just read about EarthBound 64 and I was incredibly excited. The 64DD launched exclusively in Japan in December of 1999. For reference, this was 3 months after the release of Sega's Dreamcast. Unfortunately, this expansion was dead on arrival, and it had essentially been abandoned by Nintendo by August of the following year. Games that had planned on using the DD were either released on cartridge using the more expensive ROM chips, pushed off to the GameCube, or just cancelled outright. Initially, EarthBound 64 was planned to pivot to that cartridge release, but in August of 2000, the game was unfortunately cancelled. Despite having playable demos available at the 1999 Space World Trade Show, the game was still approximately about 2 years away from completion. Those demo discs have not yet been discovered, though fans do remain hopeful that they might be discovered someday. It was a dark time for EarthBound fans, who had been eagerly awaiting news about EarthBound 64. In Iwata's statement that, despite the end of Mother 3's development on the Nintendo 64, the franchise was not abandoned, well, it left the darkest clouds of despair with only the faintest of silver linings. With only a cameo in Super Smash Bros. To comfort them, fans huddled together for the warmth of camaraderie on bulletin boards and forums of fan sites such as starman.net. Numerous petitions from fans were sent to Itoi and to Nintendo in the following years, spawning from such fan sites. The senior staff members of EarthBound 64, who had at one time felt that canceling EarthBound 64 was the right move back in 1999, had begun to feel that by this point, canceling production altogether was a tremendous waste. Iwata, at a later point, would say on the subject of EarthBound 64 that the team had just been so focused on the 3D craze that they never had stopped to consider why the game needed to be in 3D at all, when Itoi's greatest strengths were, in his words. Iwata and Miyamoto discussed transitioning to Nintendo's handheld system, but fans wouldn't hear any news about this for 4 years. Nintendo would soon be releasing a compilation cartridge onto the Game Boy Advance of the Mother series called Mother 1+2. Foreseeing an increase in demand from fans, especially having been inundated with communications and petitions from fans across the globe, Iwata, Itoi, and Miyamoto agreed that production would resume for Mother 3. Back in 1999, the same year that the 64DD was cancelled, Kamiyoka Shinichi and Koji Tsuda parted from Square, along with a handful of other development staff who had previously worked on the Final Fantasy, Saga, and Mana series. In an interview with RPGamer.com, Kamiyoka cited differences of ideals for their departure and the founding of their new company, which they had named Browny Brown. The team would go on to continue working on role-playing games for Nintendo's handheld systems, such as Magical Vacation and Sword of Mana, which I also reviewed. 3 years after the cancellation of EarthBound 64, following their release of Sword of Mana, Browny Brown joined HAL Laboratory and Shigesato Itoi, picking up where they had left off with EarthBound 64. Only this time, production would change to 2D and launch on the Game Boy Advance instead. In 2003, during a 15-second commercial for Mother 1+2, a red splash screen featuring black text in the Japanese Mr. Saturn font, Nintendo announced that there was a new entry in the Mother series once again in production for the Game Boy Advance. The EarthBound fandom collectively lost our minds and spent the remaining time counting down the days until the game's eventual release in Japan. 17-year-old me would spend lunch breaks in the high school library on the computer looking for news about possible Western releases, daydreaming about what this new Mother game could possibly be like. The wait was exquisitely excruciating, a feeling we fans would become intimately familiar with for years to come. Finally, at long last, 12 years after the release of EarthBound in Japan, the drought came to an end for Japanese fans in April of 2006. Mother 3 released for the Game Boy Advance, and it was beautiful. And yet, in the West, we continued to wait patiently with bated breath for news of a Western release. And when our patience eventually ran out, we continued waiting. And when waiting didn't work, we acted. In November of 2006, Nintendo of America's Treehouse Localization team confirmed that Nintendo was not interested in bringing Mother 3 to the West. On November 8th of 2006, Reed Young, aka Reedman, and the rest of the staff from Starman.net published a declaration. Following several coordinated calling campaigns, write-in letters, petitions, and handwritten notes from EarthBound fans, if Nintendo would not bring Mother 3 to the West, then they would. This declaration was entitled Do-It-Yourself Devotion, a title that resonated perfectly with fans. This single phrase summed up the odd, one-sided relationship Mother fans had with Nintendo. And if Nintendo wouldn't reciprocate, fans would have no choice but to use their relentless enthusiasm for the series by taking matters into their own hands. Clyde Mandolin, aka Tomato, began the arduous process of translating Mother 3, along with about a dozen other fellow fans and experienced localizers, whom Tomato had vetted personally. Among the programmers included were Jeffman, Tomato, S-Blur, and Bew. Without any source code to work from, hacking was performed at an assembly level. The team had to code their own purpose-built tools to aid in script patching. The Mother 3 fan translation was an incredibly unique project in several ways. The translation team had openly stated that they would cease development immediately if Nintendo indicated that they would localize the game to the West, and would of course cease should Nintendo demand it. Reed stated in a 2014 interview with Ars Technica that word of the project had reached the highest levels of Nintendo of America, but Nintendo never did interfere. Nintendo's policy of refusing to engage with Mother fans seemed to have continued even to this day, aside from Reggie Fils-Aimé setting one on fire during a skit for E3 years ago. Not really sure what to make of that one, Reggie.
Come on, Reggie, give us Mother 3! How about this instead?
In October of 2008, the fan translation was finally released to the West. The patch was downloaded 100,000 times in a single week, one of which was a 22-year-old me who had moved out of my parents' house and was now living in my second ever apartment. The fan patch released alongside the launch of a full-color player's guide, also produced by Starman.net. This was the first ever product produced by the team that would eventually become Fangamer.net, who still produces the book and apparel and even official collector's editions of games for fans. I've had a chance to use the player's guide for a recent playthrough, and their love for the game truly shines through in the polish and detail found throughout it. 13 years after its release in April of 2021, the Mother 3 translation patch has received its third and possibly final update, which resolves several minor bugs still present in the English localization, as well as several found in the official Japanese release. Just a couple of months ago, Mother 3 was making headlines yet again as Terry Crews sent out a tweet to localize Mother 3. The Mother 3 localization team have openly offered the localization project to Nintendo of America should they want to use it, leaving the ball squarely in Nintendo's court. So, with immense fan demand, a no-cost, turnkey solution immediately available, and greater franchise awareness than ever before thanks in no small part to Super Smash Bros. Series, why have Nintendo of America continued to ignore EarthBound fans? I have my own hypothesis on the reasons, and they are many, but that's a topic for another day. Get subscribed so you don't miss it. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and let me know in the comments if I left anything out. And I'll see you in the next one.